Hi, this is Truth Seeker here. I tell you, sometimes I just don't get it. But anyway, it actually is not a bad day for an autumn day. Summer's gone. So, I have been mentioning to you that there's a lot going on with me and my life. And there's been a lot of distraction, and I talked about it in the last video. So it's really keeping me away from doing the kinds of things that I like to do. I got a haircut yesterday, the first time in a couple months. The advantage of getting older, I guess you don't need as many haircuts as frequently. My wife dragged me down to get it cut. She said it was too shaggy, so time to get it trimmed. But anyway, I wanted to talk about sort of a weird dream. I woke this morning to a very weird dream, and it kind of lingered with me all day. It was a dream that took me back into my time and my experience in the Bible students as a young man, but from a more current perspective. And it had to do with really Norman Woodworth. He was the focus of the dream. And in this dream, I was in a Bible student convention. It was a nondescript convention, but it was more like the general convention because of the numbers of people there. It was like I remember it as a child, and I spent all my time seeking Norman Woodworth, and I couldn't find him. And I wanted to find him because I had questions to ask him. And the questions I wanted to ask had to do with things that so many of the Bible students of that era were so reluctant to talk about, and really are the things that could have really been helpful to me today. Understanding that period, understanding the individuals, understanding who they were as people, and not just that they went out of the truth, that they weren't faithful to the truth, but to get some insight into who these people really were. And if I had that opportunity today, I would have really dug in to that matter. I wouldn't have let them get away with avoiding questions about who these people were, like Alexander Hugh McMillan and Clayton Woodworth and Judge Rutherford, because Woodworth knew them. Not only knew them, he worked side by side in a very close way with these people for years, for many, many years, not just a short period of time. I think Woodworth was probably at the Bethel from his early 20s until he was in his 40s. And so he knew these guys, especially McMillan. I know he knew McMillan pretty well. And so if you guys can't remember who Woodworth is, I'll throw up his picture right here. I just grabbed this picture off the internet. It's just a standard picture. It isn't one of my personal photographs. My grandfather was a close friend of him, and I have a whole bunch of photographs of this fella. I don't know what made me think or dream about him, but it was a weird dream, and I had a very definite intent in that dream. So the dream involved me looking all over the convention for him, and I couldn't find him. And I had a very specific intent in finding him. Um, I wanted to interview him to find out a lot of the things that, today I would have asked. Things like, I would have asked him about Alexander Hugh Macmillan, because he knew Macmillan quite well. They worked together on the photodrama of creation. They were both from the same area of Canada, in Nova Scotia, I believe, and I think Macmillan was pretty much instrumental in bringing Woodworth to the Bethel, and when Woodworth was a young man. Now he was a little younger than Macmillan. He wasn't quite as old, so I guess Macmillan would have seemed more of a mentor to him. I believe Macmillan was probably in his probably a good 10 years older than between maybe 10 and 15 years older than Norman Woodworth. So he would have been looked up to by Woodworth. I know that in his autobiography, Woodworth mentions people like Rutherford, J.F. Rutherford, and others. He had personal experience with every one of these people, with Charles Taze Russell, with A.H. Macmillan, with Rutherford. And I would have asked, and I wanted, in my dream, I wanted to ask specifically questions about what they were like, and about their personalities, and about what his experiences had been with them, and to tap into that knowledge. What's so strange is that when I was a kid, it was very rarely talked about, except in nostalgic ways. The days of Brother Russell and the movement in those days. There was very little talk about Rutherford, except very negative, that he had basically stolen the movement away and the Watchtower away from the Bible students, that he had deviated from the truth, and that he had basically betrayed Russell. But aside from that, there was very little discussion about what it was like, and there were quite a number of Bible students that lived through that period that I could have tapped into, who had direct knowledge of the key people involved in the transition of the Watchtower into what it's become today. And the Watchtower basically became the organization, the large organization it is during the 1950s and 60s, and it really was quite different from its early incarnation under Russell. And the Bible students more or less preserved the culture, preserved the way things were during Russell's era in our meetings, and the format of our meetings, and the way we were culturally. But there are quite a few similarities. There's no doubt. But when an organization becomes so large, there's some inherent differences just from the fact that it's become really, really large. The Bible students never became large, never did, and thus preserved. It was really a relic of the early movement, the early Watchtower, and so I guess Woodworth died when I was in my early 20s. Let's see, 1975. I was 20 when he passed away. Now we all, even us young people, understood him to be a special person. And I remember even at a general convention that a number of us had gotten together at a general, sitting in one of the lounges in Albion College. This was around 1974. And we had all talked about what we should do in terms of interviewing Norman Woodworth. I don't know if my dream really harked back to that. I don't know if my dream harked back to those times because of all the photographs my cousin put up on Google for me. Photos I hadn't seen in years, and thousands of them that dealt with the General Convention, and most of them, every year there were at least 10 or 20 photographs that had some of the key players in the Bible student movement when I was a young child growing up. Norman Woodworth and Russell Pollock, and Ed Fay. My grandfather was one of those key individuals, only because of his position with the Dawn Bible students. The Dawn was what Woodworth established in the 1930s to preserve the work of Russell. My grandfather told me a story when I was a young man. I was probably in my early 30s. That a story about Woodworth at Bethel, where he got this sense or feeling. He had caught Russell at the Bethel. It was after a meeting, and they were all fellowshipping, and there were a lot of brethren in the room, and he was on the other side of the room, and Woodworth was a young man at the time, and he found Russell staring at him from across the room, and he felt a little ill at ease about that, and he got the sensation, the sense or the feeling that Russell was sizing him up as is this the person who will resume the work or carry on with the work that I'm doing? And so that certainly was a motivator. This was something that Woodworth had never told anybody except my grandfather, who was his closest friend and confidant at the time. And my grandfather, he didn't want me to mention the story to anybody at the time he told me. And but there's no question that if Woodworth felt that way, it was what motivated him to start the Dawn and to work the Dawn as Russell had established the Watchtower. So I don't know. It just was a really strange dream. I never did find Woodworth. I guess that may have been because I feel like I lost the opportunity I had this opportunity with a person who was there right in the middle of it all. I mean, he was Clayton J. Woodward's first cousin. He knew every one of these people intimately. He lived and worked at the Bethel until 1928. I mean that he started working at the Bethel before the photodrama of creation. So he had been at the Bethel for quite some time, and I guess his first visit to Bethel was probably around 1900 or just shortly after 1900. I forget when he was born. He may have been born around 1890, so it was probably in the decade after, around maybe 1910 or so, when he first visited the Bethel. I know that he got hooked into the Bible students at quite a young age. His father actually was a Bible student in the 1890s, and he relates a story in his autobiography about how his father had the fourth volume, and when it was first printed, and how he grew up in Nova Scotia, and his father operated a wood mill, and that he worked as a teenager in this wood mill. You know, back then they didn't have child labor laws, and they didn't have OSHA. It's lucky he had fingers and arms and stuff to work with later on. They didn't have safety equipment back in those days. But yeah, it's interesting. You can find his autobiography online, but it's very one-sided. Those would not have been the questions that would not have been the information I necessarily would have wanted, because it's very biased. It's very biased in a positive way towards his involvement in the Bible students and his role in the Bible students. It's the made-for-TV version of Woodward's story, but not the one that I would have wanted to know today. And to think that I knew this person, and that my family was very close to this person, that I could have had that opportunity to have that inside interview if I had had the wherewithal to do such a thing. But being young, you miss opportunities. You don't think of them as opportunities. You think things are going to go on forever or whatever. But I mean, we all knew that he was, or felt that he was, a very special individual for his role. He was like the second Pastor Russell to the Bible students, because of his efforts in regathering the Bible students together that didn't become Jehovah's Witnesses. And there were quite a number of them. I mean, in the 1940s, there were some 56,000 Bible students that responded to the work of the Dawn and associated with the Dawn. The thing about what happened with the Watchtower and Rutherford put such a bad taste in the mouth of Bible students that they never let another organization become dominant again in their fellowship like the Watchtower had become. And so there was a mistrust of organization. In fact, there were many Bible students who believed that once you began an organization, that it was inevitable, that it was going to go out of the truth, that it was just the way it was, just like Watchtower. And so they were reluctant to even get involved in the work of the Dawn. and we're critical of the Dawn when the Dawn printed things that did not coincide with what Russell said. So we, even within the Bible students movement, we had more of an orthodox element within it that was even less open-minded, and basically you had to take Russell at every single jot and tittle. The Bible students movement today is a direct link or lineage from those days, but there's been some dilution there. None of the original Bible students are around anymore. My generation are the older ones now. There are some that are in their 70s and 80s, but they didn't go back to Russell's day. Anybody, there's nobody left that remembers Russell. That whole generation passed away by 1980, early 1980s at the latest. In the Watchtower, I guess you had Fred Franz, who died in 1992, who was well into his 90s, and he caught the last few years of Russell. I think he was baptized around 1913. What's interesting to me is that having gone to the Watchtower Museum, it's just a few miles from here where I live. They do have. I think they have overlooked, or they don't realize who remained. And I guess they know that anybody who's going to go there today, that there were a whole bunch of those people that they show from the early days, from Russell's time, did not stay with the Watchtower. The majority of them didn't, and became Bible students later. And I found places where I recognized familiar Bible student names when I was a kid growing up. I mean, they can't erase it completely, and but I don't know if the current Watchtower leadership even understands who was and who wasn't who actually went off and remained with the Bible students. The fact, if they did know, they wouldn't put them in their museum. It's certainly evident there that they didn't put Nelson Barber in their museum. They show George Storrs, George Stetson, Henry Grew as early influences of Russell, but they omit Nelson Barber, and Barber played a huge role. I mean, Russell's first published work was a co-authored book called The Three Worlds with Nelson Barber. So, to omit Nelson Barber's association and impact on the Bible student movement and on the Jehovah's Witnesses it's analogous to having somebody write a book about World War II and omitting Hitler and his role in the war. I mean, it would be almost that blatant, and with that kind of an omission, how can you trust that organization's presentation of its own history? So that's why you can go to places like JW Facts, and I know when I look into those early books, like those early yearbooks, and I can see names that I knew. Those are not names that stayed loyal to Rutherford or stayed loyal to Watchtower. And you can find this out because you can go through and with a little bit of effort, you can compare names that disappeared from the ordained ministers list, or it became the ordained ministers list, but it's the Pilgrim speaker list in 1929, and compare that with 1930, and you'll see there was a huge turnover of names, and I think 40% of the names that were in 1929 are missing. You could see, and that's with the Bethel alone. That doesn't represent the whole movement. So you could see that Bethel, which was specially selected. I mean, Rutherford had been, by 1929, he had been the president for 12 years. And still, 40%, over 40% of the Pilgrim speakers were gone by 1930 in the yearbook. A whole different list of names. I mean, there were a lot of names that were the same. But to think that over 40% of the names disappeared that late in the game, when Rutherford was the sole person who was picking and choosing who came to Bethel and who was allowed to come to Bethel. So that's a lot of years of filtration. When you talk about there's the William Schnell book that says 75% of the original movement in Russell's day left the Watchtower by 1928, and you see the numbers. You go to JW Facts and you see the memorial numbers where there was well over an 80% decline in the number, from 1927, there's almost 90,000 memorial partakers, and then it drops in 1928 to 17,000. I mean, this is all evidence of a major shakeup, of a major turnover, and to me, it's kind of a mystery. It's like the Dark Ages, that transition period of the dissolution of Rome, Western Rome, the last remnants of Rome when they pulled their troops out of England, and they were defending the last of their territories, and the whole system kind of faded away. They didn't know at the time what was going on. People at that time didn't realize that civilization was falling apart, and that it had largely transitioned. It's the same sort of thing in my mind. The way I look at what happened with Watchtower during the late 1920s, and unfortunately, when I was growing up, we didn't get the details. Nobody gave us the details about what actually happened and what these people were like. I wish there was some discussion about that, but there was no objective discussion. There was just there was a lot of avoidance. I think there was a lot of ill feeling and a lot of hurt. I think a lot of Bible students were hurt that the Watchtower had left them. They felt disenfranchised. They felt left out. And there's this video that I used a little bit of the video in one of my previous History of the Bible Students, Who Are the Bible Students series, where the Chicago Bible students talk about their history as a Bible student class, and they bring it up to the modern period, and they began their history around 1930, around 1932, shortly after the name change to Jehovah's Witnesses, and there was a class of about 500 people, and maybe a tenth of them split off to become the Chicago Bible students. Eventually, when I was a kid, there were at least 300 in the Chicago Bible students ecclesia. They were the largest ecclesia in the United States, and so they grew again. How many of that original 500 gradually left and the Watchtower class and joined them to bolster the ranks to 300? I don't know. I don't know. But there was very little discussion about all of that by the older generation. And I guess that in a way I wish that they had been more open about it, but I guess they didn't want to chance us kids. I don't know. I guess they felt if we knew what these people were like, that we would be inquisitive and that we'd probably leave the Bible students and join the Watchtower. I don't know what the thinking was. I know that there is a 1960 talk featuring at the General Convention, 1960 General Convention, featuring Norman Woodworth and Russell Pollock, and their discussion of the Bible student history, Bible student movement. And they got to about the transition period when Russell died, and that's basically where they stopped. Woodworth called them the dark years settled in, and that was the period of the 1920s and the turbulence there. Woodworth himself didn't leave Watchtower until 1928, and so, along with many other Bible students, so they just were reluctant to talk about that, and why? That's the mystery to me, and it's a mystery forever lost. We'll never know that, because no one's left who knows the story, not the deep, true story. I mean, and it's such a shame in a way, because I knew the key players pretty well enough that if I had known to ask the right questions, I could have gotten quite a bit of information and a lot of the story about what happened, because I would have forced it from them. I would have dogged them. I would have dogged them for the truth. I wouldn't have allowed them to evade and to give me the whitewashed version that I had always heard, that they lost the Holy Spirit, and they were all influenced by a ambitious, evil emperor, really. The Star Wars evil emperor. Rutherford was the evil person, but I would have tried to have gotten as much information as I could. If it were me today, with those people 40 years ago, but it's gone. The opportunity's gone, and the little I do have, comes from family stories, things that I remember. I remember my paternal grandfather talking. He was the one I got quite a bit out of because he talked a lot about the 1920s, and the different factions, and how they were all out of the truth. You know, the layman's home missionary and the Mountain Dora class. Oh well, it looks like my computer is locked up. So anyway, it's getting a little dark, and I just wanted to touch base and it was a strange dream. It kind of lingered with me all day, and so I just thought it was something that might be interesting to people. But anyway, this is Truth Seeker here, and I'm going to be down in Myrtle Beach in another week or so. Maybe I'll make a broadcast from there. It's still summertime down there, and that's why we're heading in that direction. So anyway, I'll say goodnight and wish all of you the very best.